that is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons a podcast shall rise. H.P. Lovecraft, Weird Tales, Ramsey Campbell, Cthulhu, Laird Barron, Silent Hill, Brian Lumley, Dagon. There's something sinister out there in the cosmos, and the tendrils run deep throughout the universe. Only one woman dares to traverse the web. Mary SanGiovanni, who once again is up to cosmic shenanigans.
Hi, folks. Welcome to Cosmic Shenanigans. This is Mary SanGiovanni, up to shenanigans once again of cosmic proportions. I am very excited this week to be talking about Kiernan's short story, kind of a longish short story, called Houses Under the Sea. This story first appeared in 2007 in the Thrillers 2 anthology, edited by Robert Morrish from Cemetery Dance Publications. And it was reprinted in Lovecraft Unbound, edited by Ellen Datlow in 2009 from Dark Horse Books. In it, Kiernan says, as an avid reader of HPL since high school, I am pleased to have actually been called H.P. Lovecraft's spiritual granddaughter by more than one reviewer. I can easily name a great many authors who have had much more influence on me stylistically, but I think Lovecraft may have had the most influence in terms of theme. His cosmicism is evident in most of what I write, whether it's dark fantasy, science fiction, or erotica. The universe of my fiction is a distinctly Lovecraftian universe in the fundamental insignificance of humanity, for example, and my recurring focus on deep time. Recently, I appeared in the documentary Lovecraft, Fear of the Unknown, and have been asked to be a guest of honor at the 2010 HPL Film Festival in Portland, end quote. So Lovecraft's themes, as she mentions, are pretty strong throughout her work, and she is well known to people who read modern cosmic horror. Now, one of the things that I see as a recurring quality of modern cosmic horror, and we've discussed this before on the show, is nihilism, and in particular in the form of a jaded viewpoint of humanity about and within its own society. It's the characters themselves that have this sort of jaded viewpoint of humanity that sometimes undercuts their own significance in the world, or the significance of others in the world. And there is a kind of horror in that it's not just interdimensional or extraterrestrial beings that find us to be insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but it's other human beings. Now, sometimes this jaded viewpoint is mildly bemused, as with Nick Mamatas's work. Sometimes it's in the achingly tragic disintegration of lives and relationships, as in Laird Barron's work, for example. And sometimes it's in the morbid fascination with tragedy, as in Houses Under the Sea. This story is somewhat epistolary in format, and I use that sort of loosely, mostly because we have, and Lovecraft did this quite often, I think a number of people have taken this approach to horror, this idea of, I'm writing this letter, or in this case, this article, and the narrator of the story is essentially trying to write an article for his editor for, as some type of media explanation, some type of sensationalized explanation of past events in this man's life that have specifically to do with a cult and a death cult, and why the cultists did what they did. We see excerpts from this in this article from fiction, which we'll discuss a little bit, as well as descriptions of video, transcripts of newspaper clippings. He tries to cite a lot of the sources of things that he's talking about so that he can make a point, however strange that point may be. We get the impression that this character, in fact, it's not even an impression, it's an all out fact that this character drinks way too much. That he is teetering on the brink, if not fully fallen off the cliff of alcoholism. And that, in a lot of stories, a lot of even Lovecraft stories, the character, the narrator will say, I'm writing this under appreciable strain. I'm taking a lot of drugs for my nightmares. I'm trying to drown my nightmares out with alcohol. We have that sort of setup that this narrator was kind of a drinker before the events of this story, but this has just sort of pushed him right over the edge. That what we may be reading is a precursor to, if not an actual suicide note. The narrator, we're going to get into what his relationship is, but first we'll look at some of the elements of cosmic horror that appear in this story and how Caitlin Kiernan takes those elements and sort of reworks them. I've noticed that a lot of what I have read so far of Lovecraft Unbound does this and does it really well in really fun and new ways, that there is enough of the traditional aspects of a cosmic horror story, but that a lot of it has been modernized and repurposed for today's kind of audience. Now, we have a cult, and I've noticed that in several modern cosmic horror stories, especially stuff I've been reading or watching lately, that modern cosmic horror is looking at cults in terms of shades of gray. Now, Lovecraft looked at them with a very black and white way. He portrayed them as snarling, slavish, feral degenerates who are barely human. And what that was essentially was the faceless other. It was another version of an outside force that has different customs, different language, different methods of, conducting everyday life, invading what he thought of as his sort of charmed New England white person life. And I think that it's definitely become one of those things that has been reworked, because I think that in a lot of cases, Lovecraft's cults were basically stand-ins for other races and other cultures in a very negative light. And so it's definitely one of those things that I'm glad that modern cosmic horror has updated and reworked to be, I think, in the same spirit of otherness that we don't understand, but also has humanized them in a lot of ways. And shown perhaps, I think, a little bit more of why humanity is willing to, and I'm going to try to say this carefully. There is an element of cultism, not the occult, but of cultism, of belonging to a cult, which relies on foregoing or handing over a certain amount of personal autonomy and identity. One could say that cults fit nicely into cosmic horror because it is another way to make the individual insignificant. And we've talked, I think, in past episodes about the use of groups in modern cosmic horror that subtly, or sometimes not so subtly, reinforce that idea of handing over your individualism and thereby becoming basically a cog in the machine, which is a pervasive theme in cosmic horror. We don't see much of the cultists themselves in the story, and when they are described by the narrator, he frequently describes them in terms that suggest that they have as much autonomy as fish, that they sort of, or boats in a storm. All of the metaphors that are used indicate, I guess, as far as the narrator is concerned, a sort of lack of free will, that they are so entranced by and enthralled by their leader that they're willing to follow her anywhere, even into the depths of the sea. What we do get a little bit more of the humanity of is the leader of this death cult. Her name is Jakova Angevine, and she is responsible for the drowning deaths of her entire congregation. And it's become a big news story. She had been a university professor at Berkeley who was subsequently fired after publishing a book, The Waking of Leviathan, which had somewhat crackpot conspiracy theory type ideas in it. Basically, it was the very beginnings of this sea-based cult. But we get a certain idea of a little bit of how she ticks, and why she does the things that she does. She starts this cult called the Open Door of Night, and it considers this particular space in the Monterey Bay, this canyon, to be sacred underwater space. And the story involves not just what she did and why she might have done it, but also her possible interference with humanity's encroachment on this sacred underwater space, which we're going to come back to a little bit later. The story, as I mentioned, is told through this nameless narrator who's a journalist. He was once her lover, Jacova's lover, and we get the impression from the story that he cared about her a lot, even though there was so much about her he didn't know. And so I think there was an element of, I don't want to say protecting her, but that he was sort of enthralled by her as well. There was something fascinating about her because she was different. Because there was a sense from the time he met her that he's always known her. And that she looked at him as if she'd always known him. That certain scars she had on her back made her unique. They made her different. That when she spoke, it was so, like, sometimes things could be true, and then without ever having lied to him, sometimes then they were not true. I think what he found fascinating about her, and again, this is something that is a staple, I believe, of cosmic horror, and growing to be one of the more important staples, is this idea that reality is fluid and it is changeable, and that the purpose, in a lot of stories, the purpose of the quest for knowledge is to anchor some factual sense of reality, and that sometimes, like, that quest for knowledge undoes reality as we know it. There is a lot of that in this, and in some of the other stuff that I've read from Kiernan, there is that sense of reality being somewhat less tangible than I think people would be comfortable with. One of the things about the cult, and I think one of the things that humanizes Jacova Angevine and makes her not quite a monster, is that she's looking for peace. That the cult that she preaches, the terms, the ideology and belief of this cult, is that they will find peace and happiness in this home under the sea. That this goddess, this fish goddess, which we're going to talk about next, promises them a safe haven, a sanctuary. And I think that we get a sense, almost like if you've ever seen Game of Thrones, that what little empathy you may have for certain characters, you have because regardless of whether their motivations are right or wrong, they believe wholeheartedly that they're doing something good. And I think if you have a character, however misguided, who is doing something in her mind that is good, that is to save people and help them and bring them something better, without pretense and, without lies or subterfuge, then I think that person can't fully be a villain in the sense of an utter evil. They can be villainous in the story because ultimately what they're doing is bad. But there's something sort of redeemable or endearing maybe about a character who thinks that she's doing something good. And you get the impression that Jacova does, that she's not only compelled to do what she is doing by forces maybe beyond all of us, but that she wants to share the good of that with other people. and that the reason she doesn't share it with the narrator is because he just doesn't believe and never will. We do get the inability of the narrator to forget this woman and what happened, and that inability to forget, that peaceful oblivion Lovecraft talks about so often, is denied to him. And this is what drives him toward looking for answers, toward looking for why she did what she did while he was away in New York on assignment. And that what he finds, not only does it uncover more questions, but the few answers that he does get seem at odds with with reality as he knows it. Now, there is, again, the cosmicism of this is that there are gods and goddesses that we have maybe long forgotten about. And one of these goddesses, and I say goddess as a rare entity definitely in Lovecraftian cosmic horror, but sometimes in modern cosmic horror in general, although that seems to be changing. We have an elder deity, a rare goddess, and kind of, oddly enough, kind of a mother figure in this pantheon. And she is described in the story as, quote, and I apologize for massacring the Greek and other languages that appear in this, but she is described as, quote, mighty, undying daughter of Taphaon and serpent Echidna, Idra Lernia, Erda Lernia, gluttonous whore of all the lightless worlds, bitch bride and concubine of Father Dagon, Father Kraken. And the narrator describes, end quote, the narrator describes this statue on the altar in her temple as ugly and monstrous. And Chikova replies that all representations are hideous in that way. The cross, the crucifix of, Catholicism is sort of monstrous in the depiction of incredible violence. And what I think this may be, and I wouldn't presume to speak for Kiernan and her views of religion, but a lot of cosmic horror does sort of suggest that organized religion, any organized religion, including cults, basically subsist on promises of peace and acceptance and threats of fear. And I think there is an aspect of organized religion that one could argue, again, as an organized group. We talked about this with the military. We talked about this with cults. The idea that under certain circumstances can I don't want to say devalue individual human life, but reinforce the insignificance of the individual, especially in the face of this greater cosmic deity that should be worshipped, that we are somehow unworthy or insignificant in the eyes of these greater creatures, and that the best we can do is worship them and hope for the best, hope that they look on humanity favorably and with some love, or at least with some pity. We have an element of family in this story. And I think it's interesting because it's not something we've often talked about in Cosmic Shenanigans in modern cosmic horror, but it is something that Lovecraft has touched on in multiple stories. The Outsider is one of them. Shadows over Innismouth is probably the most famous one. And we have a little bit of that Shadow over Innismouth family lineage here, but it's far less obvious. It's really more the faintest hint, the faintest suggestion that there might be something familial about the Angevines being drawn to the sea, at least from father to daughter. We have Chikova's father, Theo Angevine, who was a teacher and basically an absolutely unimpressive novelist. He wrote mysteries, and of the passages of fiction that are quoted in this story, they are quoted from some of his novels, which the narrator had hunted down. Most of them are out of print. And in these mysteries, the passages that the narrator quotes are featured scenes of dialogue about strange aversions to and affinities for the sea, including a story that one character relates to another about a number of people just walking out into the sea and drowning. And this is one of those connections that the narrator is absolutely flabbergasted, has never been made between father and daughter. That so much of this, so much of his fiction, deals with strange things and the sea. There is an idea that when Jacova was a child, she had this near brush with drowning, and in the encounter that she claims she saw beneath, when she was beneath the water, that before she technically drowned, that she had seen demons and mermaids and things that, as a child, that's how she described them. Now, she was resuscitated, and they brought her back. But there is that suggestion, as I said, that this near brush with death, particularly this drowning death, and perhaps because of some connection to the sea through her father, or through things that her father may have done that we are unaware of, that this awakened in her the knowledge and fervor of the teachings that she goes on to impart to her cult. And that the ultimate return to the ancient mothers and fathers of the deep, as she puts it, is, a worthwhile goal. We have the sea itself. Lovecraft, I think so many of Lovecraft's monsters are aquatic in a way, partially because if you compare the creatures of the deep ocean to anything else on Earth, they look like aliens. There is the farthest you can get from a human being is something that you'd find deep in the sea. So in many ways, they are very alien to us. Almost the kinds of creatures of another world. In many ways, the sea is like space. It's not fully explored. We don't understand how all of it works. There are parts of it we cannot reach, and it is therefore capable of holding mysteries and secrets which we feel compelled to discover. There is a portion of it that is absolute lightless dark, beyond where the light of our sun and stars can reach. And it's a kind of void. And in that void, we find power that we are utterly insignificant to when we compare ourselves to it. That it is an indifferent element on our own planet that makes up most of our planet. And again, we have that idea in, pre-Lovecraftian cosmic horror and in, post-Lovecraftian cosmic horror, that the idea of the natural is supernatural, that to understand nature is to understand a connection to what lies beyond our meager understanding of what we think is the natural world, that elements of nature represent, or maybe the elder gods and goddesses represent natural forces, which are indifferent to our life and death on this planet, and far more powerful than anything that we're capable of handling. There are, of course, elements, as I said, beyond the natural, the supernatural, elements of the supernatural. They are told in some of the things that Theo Angevine relates between characters and stories, which are surprisingly like what Jacova ultimately did or was rumored to do. There's a certain element of the occult in her behavioral practices. She had this warehouse down by the wharf where certain symbols had been painted on the floor, symbols that were meant to be a doorway. And there's elements of the occult here. There's also, and perhaps maybe the most significant supernatural element, is that the narrator makes it a point to say that there are different versions of video that went out on the internet that were released by the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, that of what happened to the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute's Tiburon 2 submarine, which was the invading force, as far as Jacova was concerned, of this sacred space under the sea. In the uncut version of this video, after her death, it is said that she appears at the end, alive but changed, into something else. So then what we have here is, again, that sort of shadows over Innsmouth idea that what she had purported to be was true. What she had purported to offer her cultists was true. Now, the revelation that this kind of weird might be out there would, in this case to some extent, explain Jacova's motivations and almost work toward normalizing why she and her followers drown themselves. What we find in the story, though, is that many of the bodies, most of the bodies of her followers were found. Jacova's wasn't. But most of her bodies were most of the bodies of her cult were recovered. So one wonders if these are the bodies of people who didn't really truly believe in their hearts, or if Jacova mistakenly thought she was doing something good for these people, and yet something about her family lineage, something about things that her father did, or the fact that she had this experience as a child, this life-altering, near-death experience as a child, made her different than the people that she was preaching to. There's also that suggestion, again, that with the right preparations, humanity could transcend its own limitations, including death. So it would almost sound like a reaffirmation of the significance of humanity, especially under the right conditions, that rather than becoming slaves to the monstrosity, that is clearly out there in the sea, that we become part of it. Now, I've heard argument about, say, the shadows over Innsmouth, that by the identity, the focus on identity in today's society, the focus on individualism, that the end of Shadows over Innsmouth would be considered a happy ending, that finally the character embraced who he was and what he was destined to become and just went with it. But it was pointed out to me, and probably rightfully, that Lovecraft would not have meant this necessarily as a happy ending. It would have been resignation. It would have been a flaw in the moral fiber, perhaps, of this character, that rather than end his own life, he chose to side with the bad guys, for lack of a better way to put it. But I think that modern cosmic horror looks at that ending differently, and so looks at the horror of the story differently. What I think is perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of a lot of cosmic horror, and in this story in particular, is it comes from the way in which humanity perceives death cults. Their interest, and this is not a blanket statement about everybody, but there is a segment of people whose interest in why these death cults do what they do is not to understand as fellow human beings the motivations of cultists for seemingly senseless acts. It's not to look at them as people who have been involved in a tragedy of sorts, but it is to look at them as the other, which dehumanizes them. That there is a sort of morbid fascination when the fringe has gone awry, that it separates them from us. And again, it's just another factor, I think, of this idea that perhaps the worst perpetrators of devaluing the significance of humanity, of perpetrating a nihilistic view of the world, that everything we are and everything we do is ultimately fruitless, is within humanity itself and not with outside forces. And there's something a little sad about that and a little bit scary, but I think that's where the horror here is in the fact that this narrator is writing this story because he needs the money. He is pouring his soul out into this article about a painful memory of his, because his bosses want to sensationalize it, and he's doing it because he needs the money. And I think there's something anytime there's something dehumanizing, then I think it contributes to this overall viewpoint that humanity is insignificant in the grand scheme of bigger forces. And in this case, one of the bigger, more evil forces is media sensationalism, which is kind of interesting. It's not usually the monster of cosmic horror, but there is an element of that. There's one other thing I want to bring up about this story, mostly because, it's very clear in the story, and because Kiernan mentions it in the little blurb after her story in Lovecraft Unbound, is this idea of time. And it goes again back to the idea that cosmic horror plays on, cosmic horror is very psychological. Regardless of how gory or violent or brutal or in your face it is or not, it is always very psychological. Perhaps just as much as the nihilism and the presence of cosmic forces greater than us needs to be in a cosmic horror story, I think so too does the idea of, if not insanity, then a reevaluation of reality. That reality is not as solid as we'd like to, not as factual and put in place as we would like it to be. And one of the things that Kiernan does to suggest this is that she tells the story and admits it. The narrator admits that he tells the story out of order chronologically. That a lot of what the character is relating is more by order of importance and more by order of what he can't forget, as opposed to what he comes to realize are all the connecting pieces. So it's told more or less out of order chronologically, but in order in terms of significance. And we come to see the picture slowly being put together, almost like puzzle pieces. And the puzzle pieces are put together, and then we see the true scope of what has happened here. And I think that is an interesting technique that we do see in cosmic horror, modern cosmic horror, is that to play with reality, one of the tenets of reality as we know it is linear time. And that's something that is often manipulated in cosmic horror. So that's our show this week. Cosmic Shenanigans is brought to you by the Brian Keene Radio Network. For advertising and booking, please visit briankeene.com and click Podcast Radio. And all the information you need will be available right there for you. And that's it for this week. I'll see you next week. Bye.
Cosmic Shenanigans is a production of the Brian Keene Radio Network. You can listen to this episode and all previous episodes for free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, YouTube, Google Play Music, and wherever else podcasts are available. Cosmic Shenanigans is written and produced by Mary SanGiovanni. Our theme music is by Xander Harris. Our engineer is Matt Wilderson. Check out his books on Amazon.com. If you enjoyed this show, you might enjoy our other podcasts, The Horror Show with Brian Keene, Defenders Dialogue, and Grindcast. To advertise on Cosmic Shenanigans, visit briankeene.com and click Podcasts.